There we go. Okay. So, as I said, welcome everybody. I'm going to hand over to Nikki now. I will be monitoring the chat box throughout, so please feel free to pop any comments or responses to any questions that Nikki asks of you, or any questions you have of Nikki in the chat box. And if you do have any technical difficulties, you know, I will be watching the participants list. So if you do have to drop out and come back in, I'll try to respond as quickly as possible to let you back onto the call. Okay, thank you, Nikki.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma. So welcome to today's session, everybody, which is really about helping us to think about how we can better manage emotional conversations with staff, with colleagues, with subordinates, with peers. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in a moment. So what I'm going to do is do a very brief introduction, talk about what difficult circumstances we might come across, some of the approaches we could take, and then look at things like active listening and open questions as ways of supporting that. And then finally, think about how we can move the conversation onto practical things, because I think one of the things that often makes us wary as managers, particularly, of having these conversations with people about emotionally difficult topics, is we then think, well, if I do that, I actually really need to deal with the practical stuff, and I don't know how to do that. So we'll look at that as well. So I really just wanted to talk a little bit about my background, why it matters to manage the conversation, and how you can contribute. So, as I said earlier, my business experience is predominantly in manufacturing. I ran my own consultancy business in learning and development for a number of years. I've managed people in both business and voluntary capacity, and I've been a volunteer with Samaritans for over 25 years, and I've done a lot of training and development within the organisation, across the organisation in the UK and the Republic of Ireland, locally within the West Midlands, and also within my own branch. And I've also delivered a lot of paid training for the organisation over the years as well, talking to businesses about how better to have these kinds of conversations. And I think it matters because particularly experience within Samaritans, but also a lot of my other experience shows that actually if you show that you've listened and understood, it actually helps people to feel more appreciated, it makes them commit more, but it also can shorten the conversation. So it can actually help us to have more productive discussions with people. And people also often will talk about visible physical things, but will be less inclined to talk about the invisible things that might be worrying them. And also sometimes there's a challenge around the relationship. Is this an appropriate conversation to have with my manager? So if we can take the lead as leaders and managers in those conversations, it can make that easier for staff to be honest about what's going on and for us to be better placed to support them. As Emma's already said, if you want to use the chat to contribute, there are 2 or 3 places during the course of the presentation where I'll be asking you to contribute. And if you pop your comments in the chat box, we'll stop at an appropriate point and take those comments or questions from you. So, difficult circumstances. Well, my own experience certainly is that often people can be reluctant to share what's going on in their lives that's difficult or challenging. But, you know, last time I checked, crystal balls didn't come as part of our, usual IT package when we start work. So if we don't know there's a problem, we can't help. And as I've already said, it can often be difficult for staff to know how to engage in these conversations about things that they may be uncertain of our response, uncertain of whether it's appropriate. So I think really, if we can ensure that our colleagues, our staff know that they're going to get an empathetic response rather than a judgmental or critical one, they're much more likely to share with us what's going on. And one of the things that my experience has certainly shown me over the years is that very often lots of us, not just managers, are quite comfortable dealing with the practical things. So if somebody comes to you and says, oh, I've got this particular issue, this bit of equipment isn't working, I've got a problem getting X sorted out, then quite often as managers, we feel quite comfortable in dealing with that. We can put our problem solving hat on and go, aha, I can deal with that. And we feel quite comfortable with that. But often we're uncomfortable or much less comfortable dealing with the emotional things that either accompany these practical problems or maybe are just an issue in themselves. So what I'd like you to think about whilst I talk through the next couple of slides is what you're more uncomfortable dealing with in terms of issues. Is it the practical stuff or is it the emotional stuff? And also maybe to think about why that might be. So often I think there's a tendency for us to want to focus on the practical and ignore the emotional because we feel more confident about dealing with the practical stuff. We don't want to take the lid off any cans of worms that we might not be able to deal with afterwards if we start talking about the emotional stuff. We might worry about our response. There are all sorts of things that feed into that fear that we often have, or trepidation about dealing with the emotional content. But it's really important to remember that the other person will feel much more listened to and better supported if we actually deal with the emotion and the practical issue that underlies it. And one of the things that it's really important to remember is that it's very, very difficult if we deal with the practical issues first to then move on and deal with the emotional stuff afterwards. So that's sort of the equivalent of going, yes, I can see you're really upset so-and-so, but let me solve the problem first and then I'll ask you how you're feeling. And actually that's not a helpful way to deal with it. But also, having dealt with all the practical stuff, it's often quite hard to go back and look at the emotional things that underpin that. So it's important to recognise that much as we might be reluctant to do that, if there's an emotional content to a conversation, we need to be dealing with these emotions before we deal with the practical issues. And of course, the other reason for that is that it's almost impossible to have a logical, sensible, considered conversation with somebody about practical things if they're feeling very emotional. You think about the last time you were upset, very worried, angry. Being logical doesn't fit well with that kind of emotional feeling. So we need to address the emotions before we can start looking at the practical issues. It's also really important, though, I think, to recognise that sometimes there isn't a need to problem solve, and that sometimes it's just about listening to the emotional content. And again, I think that can be really difficult for us as managers because we seem to have either a hardwired and inbuilt view, or maybe one that we've learned through our working life, that actually our job is to solve everybody's problems. And there are a number of things that I would challenge around that. The first of all is that not all problems have solutions. The second one is that why should you or I be any better placed to solve somebody else's problems than they are? And I suppose thirdly, actually, just because a solution would be right for you doesn't necessarily mean that it's right or appropriate for someone else. So there are lots of things around the sort of the opening up of a conversation to emotional content that we need to be aware of. So in terms of supporting how this conversation goes, the first place to start is with building some rapport. You can see there I've got a dictionary definition of that. And it is about helping somebody to feel that they're understood. It develops that trust. It helps to further the understanding. And it also encourages people to be honest with us. And I think one of the big challenges that we have, and I read about it all the time in articles that I read around HR and leadership and management, is that there's lots and lots of instances previously, and now more so in the current set of circumstances around COVID and working from home, where actually people aren't necessarily being honest. They're not being honest about how challenging they're finding things, about issues and problems they might have. And there's very much a, you know, I need to be showing myself to be here and competent. So that ability to have an honest conversation is really important. And we also need to think about some open communication and empathy. And empathy is different from sympathy. Empathy is about exploring how things look and feel for the other person, so that we can understand what it feels like for them, or at least move towards that, rather than understanding how that feels for us or comparing our circumstances with theirs. which as a colleague of mine once said is the equivalent of my cat's blacker than yours, you know. And I'm sure we've all had those conversations where somebody said, oh, how are you and what's going on? And you've gone, oh, well, it's X, Y, and Z and it's really dreadful. And they go, oh, I know, I had that, was much worse. And that's not really a good way of opening up a conversation. So empathy is, I suppose, in a way about helping us develop the ability to understand things from someone else's perspective. Just because to you what they've told you doesn't sound like a big deal or particularly difficult or challenging or upsetting or worrying, doesn't mean that that's not how they feel about it. And empathy is about understanding that their reality is very different from yours or mine. So then we need to think about, actually, what does the other person want from us? Well, I think this is another problem that we sometimes have as managers. We often assume that the other person wants us to have a solution, wants us to have that magic wand, the one that goes along with the crystal ball, obviously, and solve all of their problems for them. But if you think about it, think of a time that you've shared a difficult issue with someone, something that was worrying you, maybe in the workplace, maybe outside of it. Think about what you really wanted just for a second. Just stop and think. And what most of us will recognize is that actually we don't necessarily need someone to solve our problem. We want someone to listen with some empathy, to understand things from our perspective, to reassure us that actually they've listened and heard, that we've been understood, and if it's appropriate, to think about offering maybe a solution or some support or something else. I'm often at this point when I'm talking about these things drawn to think about the difference between discussing an annoyance at work with my husband and with my adult daughter. My husband's automatic response is, well, what you need to tell them to do is, whereas my adult daughter's response is to go, oh, I know, that's really awful, isn't it? Gosh, aren't some people annoying? Oh dear, I can see why you're really ticked off about that, Mum. And it's about being able to recognize as a manager which of those is the more appropriate response at any given time. So, is there anything in the chat, Emma? Has anybody said what they're more uncomfortable with, the practical stuff or the emotional stuff, and given any reasons?
So we don't have any comments in the chat at the moment.
Okay.
If anybody would like to put any thoughts in there on Nikki's question, we'll have a little monitor of it.
Nobody got anything they want to respond to that?
Or questions even, perhaps?
No?
Nothing
Okay.
at the moment.
Well, if anybody's got any questions, then you can certainly pop them in the chat.
Oh, we've got one, Nikki, so thanks, Rebecca. So Rebecca says she finds it easier to listen without offering the solutions at work than at home. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I think sometimes, Rebecca, that's about the lesser level of emotional involvement, isn't it? It can often be easier, I think, to be that little bit more distanced with our colleagues, whereas at home you're quite emotionally invested in it, and I think sometimes that encourages us to behave differently. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. Thank you.
Carrie's also written, the emotional response is harder when there are strict HR policies in place.
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder harder how?
Should we, Carrie, do you want to come off mute and have a chat to Nikki?
Yeah, that's fine. So just meant in the sense that you can do the listening and things,
yeah,
but sometimes people hide and are worried about sharing their complete vulnerabilities, because if they share certain things from an emotional level, then as a leader stroke manager, you have a responsibility that, you know, you might have to inform HR, or if you know some information, you know, it has to be documented, and that then might prevent people from wanting to open up completely. So for example, in the past, you know, for mental health, if people have worried about sharing that because they fear that it goes against them, you know, on their HR personnel records. And I think might be due to sort of some you know, people not being aware that it's protected characteristic, etc., or can be, depending on how long they've been diagnosed. But I just think sometimes it's a barrier because people are fearful of the HR repercussions in sharing such emotional things.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. I think that's a really good point. I know exactly what you're saying there. I think one of the things that we can do as a leader and manager to help overcome that, maybe for people, is to be explicit with people about what sorts of things we might have to report, and also to be confident in saying, if somebody starts telling us something, to maybe say, you know, I understand this is really important to you. Can I just tell you that if you continue to tell me more stuff like this, that I might have to, you know, and maybe think about signposting them to somebody who doesn't have the same requirement to register it, maybe, or to log it in some way. And I think one of the big problems that I've noticed lots and lots in a lot of the work I've done is that as experienced people in leadership and management positions, we're really knowledgeable and really confident with that knowledge very often. So, you know, we might go, well, you know, Fred can talk to me about this, this and this, but if he talks to me about that and that, I have to do something about it. And I think because of that, we sometimes fall into the trap of assuming that our staff are equally as knowledgeable. And sometimes I think they're scared of telling us things that actually we wouldn't necessarily have to report or document. So I think one of the things that really that can often help overcome that is for us to be much more explicit with staff about where those boundaries are, so that there is less of that barrier that you've really clearly talked about. So I don't know if that kind of resonates with anybody or makes any sense. But thank you for that, Carrie. That's a really good point.
I was just going to ask as well, Nikki, is I don't know what you think about, but you know, if although sometimes people might be afraid for things to be reported, actually it could help them. So, you know, there is, I think they have this negative connotation of, oh, you know, it's going to get reported to HR and I don't want that to happen. But in actual fact, if you did report it to HR, then that individual might get more support and the support that they need in their job that they didn't have before.
Yes, and I think that's, again, that's part of that misconception of what the purpose of logging and reporting such things is. And again, and often that comes from prior unhelpful experiences, doesn't it? You know, if you know of someone who's said something to a manager and it's been reported to HR and they've ended up in trouble or it's caused them difficulties, then it can be quite hard for us to make the case to this person that that's not how it is here or now. But yes, I think you're right. And a lot of it, I often think a lot of the ways of overcoming this is actually just about assuming less about what other people know about what's going on and talking to them more openly so that they're really quite clear about it. Because that's the other thing is, you know, people don't listen well when they're emotional. Very often the internal noise stops them from listening well. So yeah, good point.
A couple more comments here, Nikki. So they've started coming through as we've been talking. So Harman has put, emotional issues are harder to deal with for me as practical issues have practical or textbook responses to an extent, whereas emotional issues can take you down a route which you are unfamiliar with. You may not have had experience with this before.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And one of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit moving forward is actually sort of touch a little bit on the kind of depth and level that we need to go into with these sorts of things, or strategies that stop us getting sucked into conversations that maybe we're not equipped to deal with.
And then we've also got Josiane has put, I'm comfortable dealing with emotions in conversations with my colleagues, but I can't always do anything real about it. Agree with Carrie, our management structure doesn't always allow us to accommodate other people's vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and I think that's the point where, as a manager, you take a decision sometimes maybe to signpost somebody to somewhere where you know they can get a level of support that you're not able to offer them because the management structures or policies don't allow you to do that. which is hard, but probably more use than not doing anything, I suppose. It's a difficult one, isn't it? In an ideal world, businesses, we wouldn't need to think about our structures and processes like that, but we do. Am I okay to move on, Emma?
There's a couple more that have come through there, Nikki.
Okay.
So we've got
so these two, and then I'll move on.
Okay, I have examples of staff coming to me to complain about other staff members, but they do not want me to discuss it with the other staff. So I struggle with how to support such staff. And then Carrie has just commented, that's really helpful, thank you. HR often request everything to be documented. Can be hard to know what to document regarding emotional issues as part of line management meetings. So I think Adenike, you'll probably pick up in the preceding slides, possibly.
Yeah, so just to go back to the question about staff complaining about other staff but don't want me to talk to them. My management response to that, clearly not with this tone of voice, trust me, would be to say, so, and find a nicer way of saying it, but actually, so what exactly do you want me to do with this information? In a way that says, you know, I absolutely hear you. I hear you're really cross about how your colleague has behaved. I hear that. You know, so either you can say, what would you like me to do with that information? What outcome would you like from this conversation? And then they say, well, I want you to do something about it. And you can say, well, if you want me to do something about it, I have to have a conversation with that person. How do you feel about that? Oh, well, I don't want that. Well, here are some other alternatives. You could speak to them yourself. And I, you know, again, I hear your complaint, but actually, if you want this addressing, either you or I has to have a conversation with your colleague. So I think for me, it's about encouraging staff to take responsibility for things that they ought to take responsibility for. And the other thing as a manager, and I will move on when I've said this, is it becomes really easy for us to teach our staff to dump all of their problems in our lap and not take responsibility.
5 times 6. I'll just get out. He's trying to scare me anyway. Get out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay.
I think somebody's just come off. I think somebody just came off mute there by mistake. Can we just make sure everybody's on mute? Okay, thank you.
So if you want to contribute to the next bit, you can note down in the chat any barriers to your ability to listen well. And I'm now going to talk a bit about active listening and open questions. So one of the things that gets in the way of our ability to listen whilst you're thinking about what your particular issues might be is actually the listening process itself. And if we start off here with listening, so I'm talking to you, you're listening, I've asked you to put something in the chat. So you're probably quite busy typing, not listening to what I'm saying. But also if Emma said, oh, you know, come off chat and say something, what you're doing now is you're rehearsing in your head exactly what it is you're going to say when I shut up. And whilst you're waiting for me to shut up, you're effectively doing what I think of as the in my head equivalent of drumming my fingernails on the table like that, which is cueing. So you're waiting for me to give you an opportunity to talk. And then, of course, there's the realization that at some point in this process, we actually stopped listening. And it's as the second we start to rehearse anything. So if I talk to you for 5 minutes and you start rehearsing what you want to say 30 seconds in, that's effectively 4.5 minutes worth of information that you've not had because you've been busy in your own head rehearsing and cueing, waiting for your opportunity to talk. And once we understand that, it helps us to think about not rehearsing and cueing and maybe listening to...
Mummy's nice. I am what? Dancing. No.
Excuse me, could you put yourself on mute, please, whoever that is? Thank you. So I've kind of lost my thread now. Where was I? Oh, yes. So that gets in the way of our ability to listen effectively. Emma, has anybody come up with any other barriers to listening in the chat?
Yeah, so Rebecca's just put in there about assumptions that can stop us from achieving a high level of listening as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good one. What else? Anything else?
Oh, unconscious bias, definitely.
Or conscious bias, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've got unconscious bias, assumptions. Any other thoughts from anybody? Distractions, definitely.
Oh yeah, distractions. So like we've just had with people coming off mute. So there's the external distractions, isn't there? I was really conscious when I started this that my washing machine in the bathroom next door was on a fast spin, and was thinking, I was actually not focusing on this, I was listening to the radiator rattle. So there's those kinds of external distractions. Or there's the internal voice, isn't there? Did I lock the door when I left the house this morning? What are we having for tea tonight? I've got a headache, I'm really not bothered. All of those kinds of things. Anything else?
Own emotions, so how you're feeling.
Yeah, that's a big one. And there are other things like being really tired, having had previous experience of dealing with this person before. You know, so I'm sure you're all familiar with that sinking feeling when that particular colleague wants to come and talk to you about something. You know, and that's very difficult, because then a barrier to listening effectively to that person is all the previous times they've moaned or wound you up or whatever it happens to be. So there are lots and lots of things that get in the way, but the more aware we are of our own particular issues, then actually the easier it is for us to do something about it. So when we actively listen, we need to think very carefully about being present and focusing on the other person. So that thing on the previous slide about cueing and rehearsing and cueing, that's what I have a pen and a piece of paper for. So I often jot down notes when I'm listening, because then when the other person's finished talking, I can look at my notes and think, oh yes, you said something about X. Now I can go back and ask about X. And it leaves a silence, a pause in the conversation, which is very rarely an issue in my experience, but also means that I'm giving that person my undivided attention. So things, practical things like turning away from the visual distractions, stopping those really irritating little notifications of your emails, for example, if you're sat in front of your desk talking to somebody, trying to put your own thoughts and concerns to one side, and then being genuinely interested in what they have to say, even if you think you've heard it 14 times before. So that's a really important thing to do. And then our reaction's really critical. People are looking for empathy and understanding, not judgment. I would say rarely judgment or never judgment, and rarely advice. And if they are looking for advice, then that's fine, but you should always check out that you've dealt with the emotional content first. And showing that we've understood by reacting appropriately to what's been said is really important. So phrases like, that sounds like that was really hard for you, you know, I'm sorry you're having such a bad time, are things that can really help somebody to feel listened to and allow us the opportunity to respond without maybe assuming how this person really feels about it. So somebody might tell us something, and a normal social response might be, oh, I'm terribly sorry to hear that. That must be really difficult. And I might go, well, actually, it was, you know, it wasn't such a bad thing. So somebody, a student of mine a lot of years ago, came into class one day and said, but they were told that the group were talking, and she said, oh yeah, she said, we've got a load of redundancies and I'm in the pot for it. And the group were like, oh, that's terrible, that's awful, oh, I'm so sorry. And she's like, no, actually, do you know what? I think now is the right time for me to move on. If I get a redundancy, I'm perfectly fine. Now, whilst the assumption that she would be upset by that wasn't a bad or dangerous one in that circumstance, there are other circumstances where making those assumptions could be quite damaging to the relationship or to encouraging the other person to be honest. So thinking about an appropriate response can be quite useful. A lot of the ums and ICs, the short words, or the nodding and the visible signs of encouragement to show them that we're interested are helping. And often we might need to clarify things. Sometimes people gloss over things that are really, really important or really matter to them, possibly because they're embarrassed about it, maybe because they don't know how to explore that topic in more detail. or maybe just because until you actually make them stop and think about it, they hadn't realized what a big deal it was. So sometimes in conversations, people will refer to some things quite quickly and move on. And, you know, if your instinct says, oh, I wonder if that's a bigger issue than they were saying, it can be worth going and checking that out. You know, you said a little bit ago that you'd got some issues with your IT. How big an impact is that having on you? Well, actually, it's just making me so stressed. And you suddenly realize that actually what they said was the issue is really only a part of it. And silence is really useful. The average time that we will leave a social silence before feeling driven to fill it is 4 seconds. When we're trying to talk about things that require us to think quite a lot about the answer, so if you ask me a question about something and I need to think about how to formulate my response, what are the right words to use, or you ask me something and I find it difficult to talk about that, then sometimes if we don't allow enough silence, we jump in with another question, or we tell somebody what we think their answer ought to be, rather than acknowledging that that person may need a little bit more time to do that. I think one of the hardest things, when I've trained loads of new Samaritans over the years, and one of the hardest things for very many of them, along with advice giving, is actually learning to sit with silence, and is learning to be okay with it. But it's a really valuable skill. If you can be comfortable with a pause and a silence in a conversation, that's a hugely important skill. It's really important to be honest. If you don't know, say so. Very few of us assume that everybody else has the right answers, and I think, you know, a little bit more honesty about the fact that we're not all knowing and all seeing can often help to make a relationship and a conversation better. And finally, I think summarising is really, really important, and we need to summarise the facts and the feelings. So it's not enough to say, so you're telling me you're having some IT problems. You need to say, you've clearly got some really difficult IT problems, and I can tell they're making you really stressed and anxious. Because if we acknowledge the feelings, people feel more heard. They feel as though you've really understood, and it makes them feel like you're bothered and you care. And summarising as well is a really good way of helping to move the conversation onto a different focus or topic. So we could summarise, as I just have, you know, there's a lot going on at home. I can see that things are really difficult for you. You know, obviously it sounds like you've got the family stuff under control, although that's been worrying you, and the IT's been stressing you out. Let's think about what we can do to help resolve some of those IT issues in practical terms. So you can use the summary to demonstrate that you've listened really well, to acknowledge the feelings, and then use that to move the conversation on to that practical element. So that instead of just thinking, well, we've talked about how so-and-so feels and now I haven't got a clue what to do or say, you can actually use it to, you know, to reach some kind of exit point, I suppose, with the conversation. So what I'm going to ask you to do now, fingers crossed that all the technical stuff works, is I'm going to ask you to watch this video, and then I'd like you to think about the active listening elements we've covered above and those in the video, and maybe just think about which are the ones that you do, which are the ones that you're most comfortable and least comfortable with, and what makes them difficult for you. And if you want to put something in the chat about that, feel free. Emma, if this doesn't work, please tell me.
Many of us don't listen to other people.
Is that okay?
That's working. Nikki, I'm having some trouble with mine.
Instead, we just wait and wait for our turn to express our own opinion. Take a step back and look at your colleagues' conversations. It's likely it'll look more like 2 monologues where everyone tells about themselves. The cure for it is active listening. It's a very powerful skill. It brings people closer, builds trust, and helps people to open.
Here are 5 steps on how to do it. 1. Stay
Nick, can you
focused.
hear the audio, but we can't see the video? It's gone on.
Okay, hang on.
2.
I think I've just broken it. Hang on. Where are we? Let's go back to that. Sorry. Share screen. That one. Share. That better?
Really listen. Don't think about your similar experiences and what you should tell next. 3. Allow for periods of silence. Wait till the other person speaks again. 4. From time to time, repeat the other person's words or paraphrase it back to them. It will reassure that you really listen and encourage them to open up. 5. Understand the emotions behind the words. When you paraphrase, also try to express the other feelings back to them. Active listening is rather difficult and can be more tiring than talking itself. Be prepared for long conversations. On the other hand, you will gain trust and people will simply like to spend time with you. You will also understand them much better. At the beginning, try it with your spouse or a good friend. You'll see how great they feel after talking to you. If you want to learn more about optimal lifestyle, subscribe to our channel below.
Okay. All right, I'm going to have to... Oh. Where are we? Is it that one? No, I think it was that one. Okay. Do you know, if I ever manage to get everything right on a Zoom presentation, I will be so pleased I might fall over. Right, okay, so any comments in the chat there about anything anybody finds difficult about active listening, Emma?
Nothing at the moment.
Okay, no worries, I'll come back to that. So, listening's really important, but also asking good questions matters hugely as well. And as I'm sure you're all aware, open questions are questions not requiring a yes or no answer. So things like who, what, when, where, how, those kinds of things. But we also avoid, often it's a good idea to avoid why. And if you stop and think about that, the reason is because if you say to somebody, why did you do that? Whether you say it as an accusation or not, that's often how we interpret it. So there's a judgment in there, perceived or real. So what and how are often better questions than why. So rather than saying, why did you do that? Saying, you know, what was it made you think that was a good way of dealing with it? What did you hope to achieve by that? What kind of outcome were you looking for? How did you feel when that happened? Those kinds of things are often better than just asking why. The other thing about open questions, lots of us think we ask open questions, by the way, but very often we don't. And the reason that we don't realise that we're asking lots of closed questions is because very often we ask a closed question and the other person gives us a full answer anyway. So often, you know, if you say to somebody, did you have a good weekend? They won't just go yes or no. They'll go, oh, yes, well, what we did was this, and then we did that, and then we did the other. And you don't realise that you've actually asked a closed question until you start interacting with people who find it, who often, in my experience, are feeling very low or very depressed. They will often answer.
Hi, Nikki, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself, Nikki?
Oh, Emma muted. It's all right. I got muted along with everyone else. I didn't. Sorry.
Nikki, it's just muted everybody for some reason.
Okay, well, I've just unmuted myself. Thank you for that. Yeah, so open questions. So often we don't realise we're asking closed questions because people give us very detailed answers. But often a closed question comes with an assumption. If you say to somebody on a Monday morning, did you have a good weekend? Actually, you assume, or the vast majority of us would assume, that the answer is going to be yes. So if we ask open questions, they stop us assuming we know the answer, and they make us and the person answering think more deeply. So if I say to you, what did you particularly enjoy that you did at the weekend? You have to stop and think a bit more about that than if you think about, did you have a good weekend or not? And when the time is right, we can use questions to change the focus of the conversation or agree a way forward. And I've touched on this already. So moving the conversation on is really important. Initially, we need to give the other person some space and time to talk. It's important that we check out whether they're actually looking for a solution or whether they just want us to listen. And even if they do want a solution, then the right time and place for that part of the discussion is not at the start of the conversation. We need to acknowledge what's happening and acknowledge their emotions. And then we need to empathize with them, so demonstrate some empathy. We can use summaries about both the facts and the feelings of what they've told us. And then check out if they're looking for something practical or simply a listening ear. You know, what can I do to support you with this? What can I do that would be helpful? What can the organisation do that would be helpful? And then offer whatever support is appropriate. So you're thinking about the limitations of your own role in this conversation, or the organisation's role, or a possible solution. And you don't have to have everything at your fingertips. It's perfectly okay to say to somebody, actually, I probably need to look into what help and support we could give you with that, but I will come back to you, and make sure you do. And then just reassure them that actually they can come back to you and talk about these kinds of things. And one of the things that I think is really useful, particularly at the moment, is making sure that we have a signposting, an idea of where we can signpost people to. You know, so that might be HR, it might be external organisations, you know, so Mind for mental health issues, or Samaritans if people really want to talk about difficult stuff, NHS 111, Citizens Advice, you know, all of those kinds of organisations. Think about where signposting people might be appropriate. And just remember that you might also have to acknowledge that not all problems have a solution, and that can be quite hard. So I think, is this my final slide? Yes, so my final slide then, because I'm conscious that time is dribbling away. This is a little emotional well-being model that I think it can often help us to recognise where other people are, and also to monitor and manage our own emotional well-being. So if we have a high level of emotional well-being and resilience, then when something happens that pushes that down, we have a bad day, we get some bad news, something really difficult or challenging happens, then because we've got generally a high level of emotional well-being and resilience, we bounce back to that original level fairly easily. However, if those things keep pushing us down, we can find it harder and harder to bounce back. And we start to slide down this sort of slope, I suppose. And rather than having very high levels of emotional well-being and resilience, we find that actually things start to get very difficult. It's harder for us to bounce back. Things that might seem quite small ordinarily become much bigger and much more of a challenge for us in dealing with every day. And then if this continues, then effectively we reach the point where we struggle to pick ourselves up and carry on. So I often think that, you know, this last one is the kettle blows up. You know, normally if the kettle blows up and you're up here in this green area, you know, you might tut and sigh and roll your eyes and think, oh dear, I'm now going to have to boil the water in a pan on the stove and then go out and get a kettle later, or whatever it is. If it happens when we're in this yellow area, we might get a bit upset and feel a bit panicked, and then sort of pull ourselves together a bit and think, well, I just need to get one sorted. But actually down here in this red area where we struggle to pick ourselves up and carry on, that kettle blowing up could stop us being able to function today. So it's important that we try to understand where people are when we have these conversations, but we also need to understand where we are ourselves. You know, we need to recognize this in ourselves. And one of the things I'd really ask you all to seriously think about is to think about what are the things that help you recognize when you're finding it harder to bounce back from things, or when you're struggling to pick up. Because if I think about myself, there are probably 3 or 4 things that I'm conscious of, how I respond to things, certain things, how I feel about certain things, that make me actually think, I'm probably not in as good a place emotionally as I could be. And that then allows me to think about what can I change in my life to help address my emotional well-being. So that's just sort of something really to leave you with. So I'll come back to the questions, but just before I do, I'll just flick through the next 2 slides. There are some helpful resources here, so some questions, some NHS advice, some things about your mental health, and also some helplines. And there's a really good TED talk on good conversations that I would really recommend you look at there in the helpful resources. And there's the email address if you want it. So has anybody got any questions? That's me done. I'm going to stop sharing, Emma. Okay.
Okay, apologies, my camera's not on, everybody. I had to move to my mobile phone. So as you played that video, Nikki, my iPad decided to crash and I had to sign into my mobile. So apologies for that. But I have been trying to monitor the chat. Just had a couple of comments, Nikki, that the links are a little bit unreadable on the PowerPoint, and would it be all right if we share that? Would you mind if we share that with the recording?
I think don't they go out with the recording anyway, I think, but yeah, that's fine.
On the video they might be a bit unreadable, haven't they, if they're not showing up on the screen, so I can make sure we share the resource list with everybody.
That would be lovely.
After on email. Has anybody got any additional questions? I can see the chat box, so quite happy to pose any questions to Nikki if anybody has any. I'll just allow a few people a few minutes for typing. No, there's no certificate, so it's just, as I say, a free clinic today, just to support you in the workplace. So it's not a credit-bearing course, today's session. It is just more of a session really to help you back in the workplace, okay? So Carrie has put in, how about returning to work post-COVID? Carrie, would you like to come off mute and just expand on that a little more? Oh, I think we've got school, say everyone has to be back.
I can. Yeah, I've come off mute. So schools are back in September. So there's going to be lots of staff who have previously been working from home because they were clinically vulnerable or extremely clinically vulnerable, who are now expected to come back in because all of shielding stopped on the 1st of August. HR policies, etc., are very, strict and clear in the sense that, yep, you're expected to be back in work. We'll do individual risk assessments. But some individuals are going to have really high anxiety levels.
Yes.
So, you can't necessarily give them what they want, and you can't necessarily give them what you would like to, because that's not what HR are saying has to happen. So how do you go about, or how would you suggest you go about breaking news that maybe you don't necessarily agree with yourself, but you have to?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one, because if you stick to that's the company policy, then I think people feel like you as a manager don't care. But I think it's also helpful for people to understand that it is a policy, and that, if things were different, and that, maybe you can say, I know it's really hard. I mean, I often find the empathy is the thing to say. I might say to somebody, I appreciate you're probably not going to like what I've got to tell you, and that it might be difficult for you to hear, but this is what the company has decided, and everybody's going to have to abide by it. But then I think also it's about knowing where your flexibility is, Carrie. So what can you do? What's within your gift, if you like, to this person? And also, often I think for me, it's about asking the other person what they would like to have happen, because I think we sometimes assume because we look at things from our own perspective. So somebody might come to you and say, I'm really anxious about that. And you might think, well, they're anxious because of this and this and about that and that. But actually, and they're going to want me to do things I can't do. And I think actually, if you engage with a conversation and say, so what specifically are you anxious about? And what would help deal with that anxiety? You know, what would make that better? You can at least then have a conversation which says, I can't, well, you know, you've asked for the moon on a piece of string. Well, what I can actually give you is this. So it's about knowing where you can meet people and trying to think about using positive language. So instead of going, well, I couldn't possibly do that for you, but saying, well, actually, you know, that's, I can see how that would make you feel better if we could do all of those things. What we can actually do to help you is this, this, and this. I appreciate that doesn't address everything, but you know, so I think it's about knowing what you can do. Does that help at all, Carrie?
Yeah, Carrie's just put, that's really helpful, thank you. I actually thought that was very helpful myself, because just listening to the example you gave there, the tone and the wording that you used made the same thing come across in two completely different ways, which is quite interesting when you listen to somebody else.
It does, and I think the use of positive language is something. I was talking to somebody the other day about something that hadn't gone quite right at the swimming pool, and he was like, well, you know, that's what the council have said we have to do. And I'm thinking, yes, but what I actually need you to say to me is, I can really hear how annoyed you are about that. Of course, I'll raise that with the council and we'll see what we can do to make it change. I don't necessarily expect them to change anything, but I expect to be heard. And I think that's the thing for lots of people. It's about making them feel that they've been heard. And I think Rebecca's point here on the chat is a really good one. You know, what is your bottom line? And you need to know that, don't you? You need to know what you can and can't do. So that's the first thing for you as a manager, is that clarity. And then what can we do to help makes them realize that actually it's not this massive great thing, and that often just very small things make a huge difference. So I think that's a really good point, Rebecca. Thank you for that.
Just to pick up on not so much a question but a statement from Amanda. So Amanda's just said around how important it is to self-check, as you've talked about in the last slide, and what an excellent point that is.
Yeah, because I think as a manager, the assumption very often from beneath you is that you're on top of all of this, you're perfectly fine. And often, sometimes the people above you assume the same thing, and that's not really very helpful. So I think we have to take that responsibility for being self-aware and having the courage to go, excuse me, but actually I need somebody to help or support me or whatever it is. So yeah.
Fantastic. So Josiane has put, what if as a manager you don't actually agree with the policy? It might be hard to put the message across that it is the policy.
Yeah, and I think that's difficult. And I kind of try to empathise by saying, I appreciate it's a really unpopular policy and that it feels really difficult, unkind, unpleasant, because then you're not saying, actually, I think it's a rubbish policy, which is a really dangerous line to go down as a manager, I think. But it empathises with the other person, that you acknowledge that for them it's unpleasant, difficult, tough, wrong, whatever that happens to be, really. And that's a strategy I use quite a lot, is, you know, I will quite often say, I hear that you really don't like this policy. I can see that this is really difficult for you, that it doesn't work for you, that, you know, that you feel that it's whatever it happens to be. So don't know if that helps, Josiane, at all.
Thank you. We've got no more comments now in the chat, so I think that's everybody's comments. Josie's just put, that's great. So just to close, really, thank you everybody for your time. Thank you, Nikki, for presenting today, and apologies that I had a few technical hitches. I think I got my phone up and thought, oh, I've managed to pull it back and get back onto Zoom, thankfully. We will share the recording with you. Nikki, a couple of people had asked if you wouldn't mind sharing the link for the video as well, as I think a few people would like to watch that in their own time.
So I will collect the reference list and the video link off you, if that's all right, Nikki.
That's no problem at all.
And we will include that in the email that we send out to all of the attendees today. So you should all receive that by the end of this week. But if anybody does have any questions or anything in the meantime, the email address that's on your Eventbrite invite, which is execed@wlv.ac.uk, do feel free to get in touch at any point. Thank you all for your time. Got lots of thank yous there in the chat box, Nikki. Oh, you can see those now.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Really glad everybody enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you, Emma, for hosting.
You're more than welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.